that 30% of devs say they've used ephemeral environments, and most of those who haven't thinks it sounds pretty cool. Bit sus on this one, hey Luke?
30%?
Yeah, it's a bit of
bullshit.
Hey everyone, this is Piers Sinclair from SSW TV, and I'm here with Luke Cook, and we've just done a series of Chewing the Fats on testing, and he's going to take us through the results. So take it away, Luke.
Thanks, Piers. Yes, testing, everyone's loved it. We've been doing it for the last couple of months. It's been quite a long series. So just to recap everyone on what the very first one was, testing one, it was the different types of testing, right? So this was kind of like a 50,000 foot flyover of all of the sort of different types of testing that are used in software development, all the buzzwords that we needed to use, and also sort of how those tests are structured using the testing pyramid. So what kind of information did we get from that particular topic, Piers?
Well, the first important thing is that 50% of the devs had never heard of the testing pyramid before this series.
Right, okay.
It's quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, I was surprised at some of the names as well that hadn't heard of it. I think, interesting.
Yep, the next point is that most devs are great at unit and integration tests, but less so with the higher end of the pyramid. So that's contract testing, regression testing, and end-to-end testing.
Yeah, which I guess makes sense, given that, when you're in the trenches, most of the tests that a developer is writing are the unit and the integration tests. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of that pyramid in the first place, right? Is that you do the bulk of the testing down at the bottom, and then fewer and fewer tests as you go up.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
50% of devs had never worked with resilience or chaos testing. In fact, only one dev is on a project where they're used.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, resilience testing is quite difficult, and you really need to have a decent business case before you sort of embark on something like, the chaos monkeys of, the Netflix world, things like that. But it's really good to know that we actually have some people who have actually done that before, and, some people on projects now that are doing it. It's a really good skill to have, and I think there's not a lot of people out there that would actually know what to do with resilience testing.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of firms where they don't even have that experience at all.
Yeah.
Most of the devs thought that teams should be automating all the testing, or at least almost all of the testing.
Yeah, I mean, our resident tester would probably have words to say about that.
It's a bit of a contentious point, isn't it?
It is a bit of a contentious point. But yes, again, generally, in the trenches, most of the tests you're doing are unit and integration tests. So yes, they are the tests that you're going to automate a lot of the time. But you definitely don't want to be automating all of the tests, as we learned through this series, right?
Yeah, I think the main point is to make sure that you only automate things that make sense to be automated, essentially.
Yeah. You got to get value out of that work that you're putting in, right?
For sure. And lastly, there was a fairly even spread of when devs write tests before coding, during coding, and after coding. Yeah,
now see, what would have been nice was to compare that to the testing or the development practices that are being used on those specific client projects. I mean, that's kind of hindsight is 2020, we can see that now, but it would have been nice to see if the people who do their tests before coding are on teams where the entire team is doing TDD, right? Or if that's just sort of a personal choice of that developer, whether they like the TDD approach and they do it that way irrespective of whether the team is or not.
Right, so whether it was a team-based decision or just an individual decision.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. But I mean, it's kind of interesting. I would say it's probably a personality thing, given that we've got a fairly even spread between, before, during, and after. So I think that's probably a lot of personal preference rather than an enforcement at the project level.
For sure.
Yeah.
Let's jump into some interesting feedback.
All right, what do we get?
So Hugo, he said, I have often encountered clients who explicitly requested not to write any tests because they didn't want the devs to spend time on them and wanted the devs to focus on the features.
Yep, I think that a lot of people have probably run into something like that before, where maybe, the product owner or the stakeholders just don't see any value in writing tests. They're just like, well, write it correctly the first time, and you won't need the tests. But obviously we know tests are there for a reason, they're super important, and that's just unfortunately one of those things where we as the developers are gonna have to educate those product owners on the value of investing in testing, right?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's super common and something you need to educate the product owners about, I think.
Yeah.
So Mehmet, he said, one line of code feels like 15 lines of tests.
Yeah, it can. Let's be real, it can. Absolutely. So budget your time accordingly.
For sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes it makes sense too, and sometimes it doesn't. So
absolutely.
Got to assess the situation.
Yeah. All right, so that was good for testing 1. After that, we obviously moved on to testing 2, which was how do we at SSW test our work? We just wanted to hear about how you guys adopt, the testing methodologies in your own day-to-day stuff. So which testing methods do you guys use? Where do you spend all of your time inside of that testing sphere, right? So what did we see around that?
Well, the first point was around acceptance criteria, and there was quite a spread of quality. About half the people said their PBI's acceptance criteria were good enough to test against, although they were written in a way that only other devs would understand.
The old doctor's note thing. Yes, okay.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yep.
And secondly, devs do a lot of testing during work, both ad hoc and automated tests, and interestingly, very few spend time documenting manual tests.
Right. That makes sense, right? Especially like when you're writing that feature, when you're actually churning out code. Of course, you're hitting F5, you're testing things as you go. Let's call that ad hoc testing. So obviously, devs are doing quite a lot of that, and of course, again, quite a lot of the automated tests, unit integration, etc. One thing that I think is probably worth calling out is that there's probably a lot of, say, manual tests that are being performed regularly. So, if you're working on a particular piece of software, you know how this software is meant to work, right? So when you build a new feature and you hit F5, you've probably got a little checklist of things in your head of like, I'm just going to go and check that this still works correctly. I'm just going to check that that thing still works correctly, right? It's probably worth documenting those if you find yourself doing it repeatedly, especially like imagine how much easier it is to give another dev that documented checklist and go, here you go, here are some sort of smoke tests or whatever that you should just be running fairly regularly.
Yeah, repeatability is definitely a case for documenting it and maybe even automating it if it's really a lot.
Yeah.
So the next point was that devs seem to broadly fit into 2 categories. There were some who spent less than 10% of time writing tests, and the other section, they spent greater than 25%. So you either love writing tests or you really hate them.
Okay, less than 10%, look, maybe you're that good, right? Maybe you're that good that you can just write those tests really quickly. Maybe you're getting ChatGPT to do them, but look, as you know, we budget for around 20 to 30% of development time on testing. We'd like to see those people in the less than 10% category probably lifting their game a bit, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And most of the time, it's up to the developer working on a PBI to decide whether to write a test, automated or manual, or not.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think while devs are often best placed to make a quick judgment call, the team should really set the expectation for each feature and PBI.
Yeah, I agree, right? So you're the one writing the code. It's up to you to decide at that point, you're the best person to write a test for it. Really, most of the time you should be writing a test. And I think it's the team's responsibility, say, at the time of PR, to make sure that there are accompanying tests for whatever feature you're building. And if there aren't, there better be a good reason why not.
Yeah, generally I'd set like a standard with the team. So this is what we're going to do for most PBIs. And then if you have an exceptional PBI, then I would probably make an exception in the acceptance criteria for that one. But you've got a standard to fall back on that you've discussed as a team.
Cool. Nice.
So the next point was that almost no one has used Azure Test Plans or similar tools to do manual testing tracking.
Yeah, again, I think that makes sense because, SSW, we have a small but dedicated QA team. So we just don't have enough people on board that would sort of warrant spinning up something like Azure Test Plans. In fact, we even got some of our devs to go reach out to some of the clients who are quite test heavy, and we couldn't find anyone else that was using these tools either. They're either using like spreadsheets or Confluence or some external system just to have a checklist of tests that they perform, right? So there seems to be very little integration of human tests inside of the actual PBI lifecycle, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So let's jump into the interesting feedback. So Matt Goldman said that most of the tests we write as developers are tests to prevent someone else from breaking our code, rather than testing the product meets the specified functional requirements.
Yeah, that's true. I don't want to say that you shouldn't be protecting yourself against other developers' changes. You absolutely should, but don't lose sight of the goal. The goal is to produce a piece of software that does what it says on the tin. So make sure you got tests that sort of lean that way as well.
Yeah, I think the core point there is make sure you check the acceptance criteria and you test for those things.
Yeah.
Of course, you can test other things you think might break as well, but make sure you've done the acceptance criteria at the minimum. So Sam Wagner, he said, code coverage is a terrible metric for defining if tests are good or valuable.
Valid, yes. Code coverage doesn't tell you whether those tests are actually producing any value. I don't know if we have much any other metrics that we can kind of demonstrate to a client, though, that they have some level of confidence in their tests. Value is a very subjective thing. You can't really sit down to a product owner and run through all of the different code branches and explain what you're testing against what you're not. Really, they're just there to be like, look, how confident can I be that this release is not going to burst into flames? It's like, well, we've got tests that cover about 60, 70% of the code base, right? That's about as confident as you can be. So yeah, I agree. It is a terrible metric for defining if tests are good or valuable, but it is a metric that you can use to have some confidence in your software. And it's kind of the only one I can think of that's in the testing space, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's often just about educating the product owner that, having a higher percentage isn't always better. And you just educate them that, this specific feature doesn't really get any benefit from increasing the code coverage. And then you should be covering your bases.
I think that's actually one really good point for having a dedicated human tester. They're going to be able to tell you whether you have valuable tests or pointless tests, right? That's kind of what they're there for. So it's probably good at least to get someone to go and review those tests on some sort of interval, whether that's once a month, once a year, something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Nice. So then we moved on, we had a bit of a break, and then we moved on to testing number 3, which was automating tests. So obviously, if we look back at point number 1, most devs think that you should automate all the tests, or as many as you can. As we saw from Lee's rule, there are certain tests that do lend themselves to automation, and then there are some that you just shouldn't automate at all, or could be very, very difficult to automate, right? And I think we asked a little bit about what sort of tools these devs are using to do their testing as well. So what did we learn from that series?
Yeah, we learned that XUnit and NUnit, they take the cake for the most common testing frameworks for backend with similar levels of people. Mock was also used extensively, which is another tool. And we saw that Respawn and test containers are actually seeing use on a couple of client projects, which is awesome to see because they're up and coming technologies.
Yeah, in fact, we've adopted Respawn and test containers for our SSW clean architecture template, right? Those guys love it. It just solves so many problems with integration tests and having a golden data set with which you can run those tests against. It makes life a lot easier for those. And so we expect that to just go up as we start rolling out that template across more projects.
Yeah, for sure. And in the front-end sphere, we had Jest and Karma and Jasmine. So those were the most popular ones there.
Yeah, fairly even spread too from memory across all of those. So there's it's surprising really, because most people don't care a huge amount about front-end tests, whereas it looks SSW does, right? We've got skills in pretty much all of the major testing tools for front-end as well. It's great.
It makes you wonder if it's more of a contentious topic where people have their opinions, or if they're just using the tool that's given to them for the specific project.
Good question. Good question.
So I'd like to find that out.
Yeah. We did have some examples of, say, what tests are good for automation and what tests aren't so good for automation. Again, we sort of reached out to you guys. These were in the comments. So what did we hear from the team?
Yeah, so Bryden said that Jaden recently did an accessibility test for a client, and that was a fantastic case for doing tests manually.
Yeah, accessibility tests, difficult to automate, nigh impossible, one would say.
Yes. Warwick said everything sysadmin.
Yep. Can't write an automated test to make sure a printer's working, can you?
Yeah, that's right.
So.
Yes.
I'm joking, Warwick. I know you guys do a lot more than that, obviously. Yes.
Lee Hawkins, he said, testing a feature still under development, getting human testers involved early and throughout the development of features is an excellent way to reduce risk, discover problems earlier, etc.
Yes. He's our testing guru. I am definitely not going to second guess him. I would say that there's probably a point that's considered too early. Like if a tester shows up and says, hey, all this stuff doesn't work. Yes, I know, it's because we haven't built it yet, right? So just keep that in balance,
yeah,
right?
For sure.
Yeah.
And then Anton said, manual testing is more valuable when requiring subjective judgment. So for example, does it look nice?
Yeah, in fact, that was a common theme across a lot of the comments. You're on the money, guys. You know, UI, UX testing, very difficult to automate because it requires a human to make sure that the user experience is good, it's acceptable, right? You can't really get a machine to do that, or at least not as well as you can a human. So that's definitely something that's worthwhile putting in front of a person. And what about the other way, where we've got certain tests that are like better as automated tests that people might do manually a lot of the time?
Yeah, for sure. So Bryden said that verifying login flows and logins should be infinitely repeatable with the same outcome. So it's critical to not change them unintentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's an important one because authentication is really liable to break easily. And it's something that can be really frustrating for your users.
Yeah, it's the first roadblock in using most apps, right?
Yeah,
You've got to log in, so it better work.
Yeah, and if you can't log into an app, what's the first thing you do? You get right out of there. You don't want to be on that page, right?
Yes, that's right.
So Brady Strout, he said that he developed a test to verify each query and command was linked to a specific function, and that ensured that users only accessed what they were authorized to view in the application. This was manually tested for a long time, and once the test was written, they found there were a bunch of endpoints that were open to any user, which was terrible.
Yeah, it's a great point. Really great use of implementing automated testing to cover a much larger volume. And there were quite a lot of comments around that where you can just churn through way more test cases with automated tests than you can with a human sitting there and doing it. So that's a great example of automating something. Absolutely.
Cool. So Andrew Harris, he said every automated test ever written. Once written, an automated test is something that no longer needs manual testing and saves resources, time, and provides confidence.
I'm going to stick my neck out here and say I disagree with that. People write automated tests a lot when it's just low value or it's producing false positives or what have you. So I don't agree that every automated test is better than a manual test. I definitely see his point, right? We can all agree that yes, automated tests do provide sort of lasting value, but they also do come with overhead, maintenance. Those tests will expire as the underlying code changes. You will have to keep them up to date. So again, it comes back to, I think, the crux of Lee's rule, which is there are tests that you should be automating, and then there are tests that you shouldn't. And if you try and automate those ones that you shouldn't, you're not going to get value out of them. In fact, you're going to spend money on them, right, for very little ROI.
Yeah, for sure. I think an automated test that is good delivers immense value to a company, but one that's bad can have disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
Like things that are subjective, it's just so hard to automate that because it sort of depends on the person's opinion, and a computer doesn't have opinions, right?
Yeah. I think that actually brings us to our very last point, which is which tests should you just never bother trying to automate, right?
Yes.
And UI, UX tests, they're very, very difficult. Like there would have to be an extremely strong business case to put in the amount of effort that you would need to write automated tests around UI and UX testability.
Yeah, I think computers just don't think that way. They're very logical, binary in their output. It doesn't really translate to that sort of, does this feel right kind of thing? Yeah, so.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's move on to the interesting feedback. So Matt Goldman, he came up again.
He's got good comments, man. He's got good comments, right?
He said automated testing is awesome, but the question to automate comes a long way down the road from first deciding what to test. Once you know what needs to be tested, then you can figure out how to test it.
Yeah, and that got big ups from Lee Hawkins as well. He's like, look, this is what I've been screaming about for my entire existence. And yeah, like Goldie hit the nail on the head, right? Figure out what you should test first, and then later on figure out the best way to test it, whether that's automated, manual, what have you, right?
Yeah, and following on from that, Luke Parker said, a lot of people never stop to think if they should, not how they can. I like these rules to add ammunition to discussions when people are asking about testing to going down the wrong track.
Yeah, I think his point there is, product owners, like a lot of devs, will just say, automate everything, man. Automate all the tests. I don't want any manual tests. It's just not feasible.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And we need to be able to educate people. These rules help doing that.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Okay, testing 4. We're almost there, guys. So this one was a bit of out of left field, shall we say. This is the Michael Jackson rule. Do you get a signature before starting work? Look, we got some comments, we'll get to them. But basically, testing code, that's tricky. Testing human interpretation, much harder, right? And I think this rule kind of focuses on the source of truth that all devs use when they're trying to build software, PBI, right? What does that PBI say? What is it asking you to do? What's its acceptance criteria that measures whether you succeeded in accomplishing that goal or not, right? And so what do we see from that?
Well, I think the first point that I want to mention is that the reason that we care about this in terms of testing is you want to test the PBI, not only the code. So you're actually testing that the PBI meets your criteria before you go and develop a whole bunch of stuff and then find out, well, the PBI is all wrong.
Yeah, and we might see some evidence that backs that up. Right?
Yeah, for sure. So the first point was most devs find that when they ask for a check buy on a PBI, the PO pays closer attention.
Yep, that makes sense.
Following on from that, when devs add PBIs to the backlog, it's rare that they ask for a check buy.
Because it's normally the realm of the product owner.
Right,
they're meant to be in control of the backlog, right? But devs will often add things on their behalf.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it is valuable to get that check buy.
Yeah.
And following on from that, about half of the devs, they had a PBI with incorrect acceptance criteria in the last week. So if they made that call to the product owner, they would probably not have the same result.
Right. So we all agree that getting a checked buy means that the PO is going to pay closer attention. We all agree that by the PO paying closer attention, that it's going to be more accurate. We all agree that no one really does that. And finally, there's a lot of PBIs that are inaccurate. I don't know, is that a coincidence?
I know, right?
All right. So some interesting feedback we got on this one was that it's coming back to the comments, right? Alex Rothwell was like, I don't think this should have been considered part of the testing series. To me, it's more about good consulting practices in general. Yes, it's about good consulting practices. I still think it slots in very well into the testing series. Lee Hawkins, our resident tester, not sure why this topic is part of the testing series. So a lot of people kind of looked at this and went, don't know why we're talking about this in a testing series. I mean...
Yeah, so that goes back to my earlier point. You know, it's about testing the PBI, not testing the code. And if you have a well-formed PBI and you know it's been tested, you're going to have much more confidence that you're doing the right thing with the code when you go and build it out.
Yeah, like we're talking about points of failure here, right? Interpreting a PBI is the first point of failure. You can misinterpret something. You might misinterpret a conversation that you had with the product owner and you write it down and it's wrong, right? Checked buy is meant to try and mitigate those sorts of risks again.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
That's the magic word.
And I can't tell you the amount of times that's saved my skin because the product owner's gone, oh, actually, I didn't think about this. And then they want to add it in, you know?
Yeah. All right, last one, guys. Testing number 5. Do you get a human to test? So again, this one was basically about, look, we do a lot of testing at SSW. You know, we always commit to doing test please, getting checked buys. It's sort of really big in our culture. Most of those sorts of day-to-day tests, I guess from a developer's perspective, are for a pull request. When you review a PR, right, that's considered a test please. You raise a PR, someone else looks at your code. But we kind of wanted to figure out what people were doing beyond that. Like what other sort of tests and checks are they doing? Because it's quite difficult to try and compile an application in your head and follow through all of the different branching strategies, right? So I would argue PRs aren't enough. So we kind of ask you guys, what else do you do? What does this look like from your perspective? So what do we learn from that?
Well, the first thing we learned is that 50% of devs say their most common testing method is reviewing PRs. 25% of devs say they run the branch locally, and 25% of devs say they do an over-the-shoulder check.
Yeah. Look, obviously reviewing PRs is essential. We don't allow code to be merged without a PR, right? Unless you're one lonely dev who's just committing straight to main, in which case, I'm sorry for your situation. Please ask Euler to put another dev on with you.
Bloody Euler.
But look, nothing beats actually running the software, using the software yourself, even if it's just walking over to that dev's machine and kicking them off their computer and going, all right, give me the keyboard and mouse. What did you just build? Let me play with it, right? Over-the-shoulder checks, super valuable, gets you a lot more exposure to the actual app and all the different paths just by virtue of interacting with it as it's running, right?
For sure, and I think that one of the core points is that the person developing the feature, they have implicit biases. And if you get a second set of eyes, they're going to come at it from a fresh perspective. They don't have all the biases from when they've been developing the code, and they're going to attack it from a new angle.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So the next point was that 30% of devs say they've used ephemeral environments, and most of those who haven't thinks it sounds pretty cool. Bit sus on this one, hey Luke.
30%.
Yeah, it's a bit of
Bullshit. Right? No way has anyone used, like 30% of devs used ephemeral environments. Y'all are lying.
Yeah, I'd be shocked, honestly. It sounds crazy. I don't actually know anyone that's used it personally, but
No.
you know,
Look,
could be
if
wrong.
you have, I will fall on my sword. Ephemeral environments, they're awesome. They're a super pain in the ass to set up sometimes, right? But they provide probably the best testing experience that you can get. All right, one of the really big, hard-hitting questions we asked for this last series was, all right, what sort of questions do you ask yourself when you're trying to decide whether you should be writing a test for this bit of code that you're working on or not, right? And what are some of those responses that we got?
Well, the first one was from Brady, the bug-free developer, Stroud, and he said the quality of the developers. So shots fired there.
Thanks, Brady. Love it.
I know who to blame for my next PBI.
Yeah, that's right. We'll put Brady on your project. You'll never have to write a single test, I think, is what he's trying to say.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Then we have Wixie. He said, I'd want to get an actual test manager to estimate on these things. I know that the ideal dev tester ratio is 1:1, so I'd expect that this would apply to estimates as well. And following on from that, Daniel Mackay, he said that the size of the team should be 1:5. So there's clearly a difference in expectations there.
So Wixie's saying that ideally we should have 1:1 ratio for a dev to tester. And Daniel is saying that it should be a 1:5 ratio, as in one tester per 5 developers.
Correct.
Right.
So clearly SSW is not aligned on this point.
No.
Maybe we should have a discussion.
Yeah, like, it was obviously a valuable question, right?
Yeah, for sure.
What else did we hear?
Well, we heard that Stephen said risk was a big factor. Potential risk that can cause severe consequences in case of failure, such as launching a rocket.
Yeah, like a bit of a hyperbolic example, but yes, absolutely. Like risk is the number one key, right? Like that word shows up in all of our testing rules. You know, Lee has a PhD in this. He always preaches to us, you should be looking at testing in terms of risk. That's the lens that we're looking through. So not the size of the team necessarily. I'm not saying that any of these other suggestions are wrong. I'm just saying that they play second fiddle to the risk, right? That should be your primary decision point when you're deciding on testers, you know, dedicated QA teams in the project or what have you. Like, what's gonna happen if this fails? Right? Not much. Okay, you probably don't need a dedicated QA team, right? If it's a rocket, you probably want a QA team, right? It's a lot of money down the drain if that thing blows up.
So going back to Daniel and Wixie, they're both kind of right. It just depends on the risk of the project as to how many you'd add in.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that we need to bear in mind as a consultancy is that there's a bit of risk for us as well. You know, if you go onto a client project and that client says, don't write any tests, don't need them, just get the product out the door, build those features, like Hugo's comment on testing one, right? Don't spend time testing. So, okay. And then we produce this software, and then the client goes around bad-mouthing us, going, oh man, SSW, they wrote all this like buggy software, things are falling over left, right, and center, right? That makes us look bad. So testing is to cover our bums just as much as it is to cover the clients as well, right?
Yeah, so if the client tells you, I don't want any testing, you really got to push back on that and let them know how important it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So onto the interesting feedback. Matt Parker said, I think we should have an SSW rule for human testing if there is an expectation or an agreed upon standard for PBI test pleasers other than PRs. Sam Wagner, he said, it's imperative that an over-the-shoulder review happens. There are countless opportunities for criticism that would be otherwise lost in a PR, and when the person is in a call next to you, they are more receptive to helping you, and you're more receptive to receiving that help.
Yeah, I think valid, super valid. It's what we were talking about before, right? Over-the-shoulder checks just give you a different lens with which to see and use that software through. Like I said, it's really hard to just sort of compile that application in your head from a PR perspective. Doing an over-the-shoulder check, being able to ask questions, like what does this line do? Oh, okay, yep, no worries. It's just a much better experience for everyone involved, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
I can say that from the receiving end, it's much better to get a call from someone and have them, you know, ask you questions and walk you through stuff, rather than getting, you know, a PR rejected with like 65 comments of just like, fix this. It's like, we could have had a conversation about that.
There's also nothing worse than getting a PR link from somebody saying, review this, and then you go in and you look at it and go, now what is going on here? I don't have any context around what this change is. Now I've got to read the PBI.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it just takes you a long time.
It's a whole drama,
so, yeah.
right?
So Brighton Oliver, he said, I think this one missed the mark quite a bit. It really pushed the superficial testing that we try and get away with on many projects.
Yeah, that's like, it's an interesting take. I think reading between the lines here, he's trying to say that there's always room for improvement, and we can probably improve in the testing space. I would agree with that completely, right?
Yeah, I think his point is kind of that don't just do a PR, make sure you do something beyond a PR. You don't want to only do a PR.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting conversation because perhaps we need to have a more formal testing process defined. And yeah, that ties in with both Matt and Sam's comments as well. So let's wrap up.
Okay.
Take it away, Luke.
All right, so to wrap up, look, a lot of the comments and a lot of the sort of perspectives on this is that testing is considered, like, you know, one of the low-hanging fruits. If budget or resources become a problem, testing is often the first thing on the chopping block, right? Like, oh yeah, we don't need the test, get rid of them, you know, we just want the features out, something like that.
Dangerous mentality, that one.
It is, right? Like, if you're building something that is going to potentially kill somebody, right? And you're got a budget constraint, you're not going to be skimping on testing, right? You're going to be skimping on something else instead.
That's for sure.
Yeah, again, you've got to see everything through the lens of risk. If the risk is high, find something else of low value to cut. I don't know, like designers, right?
I'm sure they'd love to hear that.
Anyway,
Maybe you could cut devs.
Yeah, maybe. Look, that wraps up our testing series, guys. Let us know what you think. If you learned anything, you know, if there's anything that you will change in your day-to-day as a result of this. Also, let us know what you thought of, you know, having a stand-in for Adam Kogan on this Digesting the Fat. He's a busy man today, so we couldn't get him. But, you know, look, we'll see what everyone thinks of it. This has been Luke and Piers from SSW, and we'll see you next time.